The good news is I don't have any PowerPoints. Okay, the bad news is I have no formal presentation for you guys at all. None. I have nothing of value to tell you. You can all go home now. Because I've been stewing. I've been here for about an hour doing a variety of things around the conference, stewing on my topic. Because by the way, I never ever prepare for any talk I ever give. And this relates to my ADD. The theory being, if I prepare for a talk, by the time I finish preparing, I'm bored with the talk. And the last thing you guys want is a speaker who's bored with his material. So I'm like you guys. I'm in as much anticipation of what I might say as you guys are. Okay, so here's what I do know, and then we're going to go straight to questions and hopefully answers. I've started a bunch of businesses. I like to think of them all as open source businesses because I think of open source a little bit differently than most people do. So I'll start with that. I'll give you a quick resume. My actual profession, most of us actually have a profession who start businesses. Whether we are architects who then start a business or whether we're accountants who then start a business. So you talk to a CEO and you say, what are you? What's your occupation? And that CEO will typically not tell you that he's the CEO of Bank of America. He'll tell you that he is an accountant or he's an architect, that he happened to become a CEO. Okay, in my case, I'm a typewriter sales guy. That's what I do. I sell typewriters. I graduated from selling typewriters to selling visions about how a software industry could improve on itself, it was an interesting sell. It actually went pretty well. But I started off in the typewriter business. I built a typewriter rental business called Hamilton Executive Services. We evolved from that. This is in the late 70s. Typewriters were already on their way out then. We evolved from that into Hamilton Rentals, where we rented computers. I then left that company and started another computer leasing company by the name of Vernon Computer Leasing, which I haven't checked recently, is still in business, both in Toronto and Atlanta, two different companies, both called Vernon. A long shaggy dog story. I found myself unemployed working out of my wife's sewing closet in 1992. I was actually doing a little Unix newsletter, New York Unix. I would ask my readers what they wanted to read about my little newsletter that they weren't getting in the major mainstream computer magazines. My readers said, well, the only thing no one seems to be talking about is free software. So that's what I started writing about. In 92, when I wrote about it, I would ask these guys, the engineers who were asking me to write about it, I was saying, well, tell me about this stuff. And they would explain that free software is from engineers according to their skill, to engineers according to their need. And for those of you who are old enough, you'll remember that was Karl Marx's line, and the Berlin Wall had just fallen at that time. And I'm going, I don't think there's a future to this open source software. So for the record, I was more skeptical of free and open source software in 1992 than Bill Gates is today. Okay, but by 94, instead of open source or free software going away, it kept getting better. In 92, Torvalds had just released number 0.98, I think. By 94, he actually had version 1.0 out. My customers who were by then buying Slackware from me were using it for ever more sophisticated uses. And as a good capitalist business guy, I'm going, there's got to be something going on here that the engineers don't even understand. The engineers who are writing this stuff, who are telling me that it's altruism. That can't be the whole story. And if I made any contribution to Red Hat or to the open source movement, It was all thanks to a fellow called Don Becker, who was writing the Ethernet drivers for Goddard Space Flight Laboratory, and his boss, Dr. Thomas Sterling. And so this was late 94. I was at the DC, Washington, DC, Linux Users Conference that Don Becker had organized. After the conference, Don says, hey, Bob, you should come back to Goddard and see what we're doing with Linux. So I said, sure. So 10 o'clock at night, we show up at Goddard Space Flight Laboratory. There's a whole nother story, by the way. I'm originally Canadian. At that time, I didn't have my US citizenship. The hoops we had to jump through to get me through the gatehouse at Goddard Space Flight Laboratory. But buy me a beer, I'll tell you that story. So this story simply goes that, I'm looking at, Don shows me this thing, and he's got boxes, Intel boxes, this big. He's got 16 of them, 4 up, 4 across, wrapped in duct tape with Ethernet cards in the back of all of them and Ethernet cables connecting one to the other. And he had just unplugged a Cray supercomputer and replaced it with this thing, $150,000 worth of hardware. And I'm thinking, in the back of my head, there's no future to this Linux free software stuff. So I start asking Don. I'm saying, Don, hold on, you're like an employee here, right? And Don goes, yeah, you're like a well-paid employee. He goes, I suppose. I go, okay, and this is a bunch of hardware that may be duct taped, but how much is this stuff worth? Don's estimate at the time, $150,000. I go, Don, who the hell at Goddard is paying you to write software that you then upload to the internet and give away for free? And he goes, I'd never, he said, and my question was, why are they letting you do this? If they're spending real money on you to write this software, they could sell it to Sun or any of the Unix guys. Why are they giving it away for free? Don says, I've never really thought about it that way. So I'm asking Don, who pays your bills? He says, Dr. Thomas Sterling. I said, well, next time I'm in Washington, you'll have to introduce me. He says, oh, Bob, let me make a phone call because Dr. Sterling works as stupid hours as I do. He calls, Sterling was there. We invite him down to the cafeteria. We have a cup of coffee. And I asked Sterling this question. Why are you paying Don a big salary to write software you give away for free? Sterling says, okay, Bob, let me get this right. You're selling, at this time we were selling lots of Slackware Linux. So you're selling or using our Ethernet drivers for free. And all we get in return, Bob, make sure we get this right. I give you stuff that might be worth $25,000, maybe more. But all I get in return is I get a gigabyte worth of software with complete source code to it and a license to do whatever I want with it, including putting it on as many machines as I can put my hands on. And he says, and you're taking advantage of me? And he had just finished articulating a barter system. And I go, oh, barter system. I understand barter systems. And the good capitalist in me, as a result of that conversation, then partnered up with Mark Ewing, and I bet my kids' college education that we could actually build a business around open source software. And the rest was history. But all thanks to Don Becker. Okay, so that's how I got into the open source business. That's the full extent of my expertise. You can go home now. But the actual answer to the question of how do you build an open source software company, of course, varies software company by software company. So as a result, the question is, what do you guys want to know? What are you trying to do? So let's go straight to the questions. Yeah.
I'm a Red Hat employee. It's nice to finally meet you. Can you give a little more detail about the early days of Red Hat and some of the challenges that you had? You led us up to the first step. What happened after that?
What happened after that? Well, oh golly. You're going to have to feed me a lot of beer to get the whole story. But, okay, so the very specific business that we adopted, because we were selling a concept that no one was buying. I mean, literally, I would go to technology trade shows, because I was from the hardware side, hardware and finance, and now I'm trying to sell software to people. So I would go to the technology shows, not to buy product, but to chat to the other executives and say, hey, I'm trying to start a software company, give me some advice. And they'd all listen to the story, and they would all give me exactly the same answer, which was, Bob, you know, what you're doing is really fascinating, but I hate to break it to you, you can't make money if you give your software away for free in the software business. So I filed that one away. But what I understood from what Don Becker was telling me and many of the other open source engineers who were buying Slackware from me at the time was the only reason they were buying Linux, Slackware, Red Hat, or anything else was because it gave them a benefit that they could not get anywhere else. And the benefit was not faster, better, or cheaper software. When I would sit these guys and grill them on why they're using Linux instead of Solaris, the really good guys, the guys who were doing serious work with it, saying, well, I'd rather use Solaris. It's so much better than Linux. It really is, it has all the applications, it's been tuned, it's been, you know, I got Sun Microsystems to support it. So I'm going, okay, so why aren't you using Solaris? You guys at Southwest Bell was one of these conversations. You guys have more money than God. You can buy another copy of Solaris. And they'd say, well, no, I sort of have to use Linux. He wasn't using Linux because he wanted to. He didn't believe in open source. He was being forced to use Linux because only by using Linux could he tweak the operating system to the needs of the systems that they were building. And as an old typewriter sales guy, what I recognized, and the first thing you learn in typewriter sales, by the way, is you don't sell features, you sell benefits. So you sell your typewriter not because it types faster than someone else's typewriter, but because it makes your secretary more efficient. By making your secretary more efficient, it allows you to make more sales calls. By making more sales calls, you make your company more successful. It's not because your secretary not because the typewriter types faster, it's the productivity as a result of it. So in open source, it wasn't that, that Linux was better, faster, cheaper, it was that you could customize it. That was the benefit we were selling. So when the software executives told me I couldn't make money selling I couldn't make money if I gave my software away, I understood that I had to give my software away. I had no choice. That was the whole value proposition. I remember this funny conversation that I had with Richard Stallman. To this very day, Richard Stallman can't figure out what to do with me because he knows I'm a capitalist business guy and I'm going to screw my customers over if I think I can make an extra dollar worth of profit, which I probably would do if I could make an extra dollar worth of profit. But what Stallman didn't recognize is Red Hat's business model is more committed to his vision of open source software than he is. Because the value proposition that Red Hat delivers is control over the technology that its customers need. If the customer doesn't need control over technology, if you're a dentist and you need a dental office billing system, buy a proprietary one because you don't need source code. You don't want source code. Anyway, but our business model nonetheless, the joke we used to tell in the early days of Red Hat when we would go to trade shows and we were selling Linux in a box because the internet bandwidth was slow at the time. Downloading a gigabyte worth of software wasn't really doable for most engineers. So they would buy CDs from us. And so we were selling Red Hat Linux boxes. But the sales pitch on the booth was people would come up and say, so what are you selling? I'm saying, well, I'm selling free software. But I'm pretty much the opposite of every other software company here who will sell you their software, but they'll give you the hat and the t-shirt. We give you the software, we sell you the hats and the t-shirts. Other questions?
So how do you, if you go to trying to sell someone this notion that they need to control the software, how do you go about selling that if they don't know it already? But you think their industry might benefit from having them control the software?
Okay, so the way to think about this, because I can't answer the question, because it varies from project to project. But what you have to do is you have to understand where your customer is coming from and how your product solves his problem. Not is a better product than someone else's product, but actually solves his problem. And here's a rule, by the way, that you can write down. This is hard established. You know how your kids will go, "Daddy, Daddy, I need an ice cream cone." And you give them a hug and you say, "No, dear, you want an ice cream cone, you need spinach." Okay. Customers are exactly like your kids. They will tell you, "I want a cheaper Drupal," or "I want a cheaper cloud solution." That's what they want. That's not what they need. They need something that will make their customers more successful or lower their costs. So the problem is, and the challenge is, you actually have to understand how your product operates within their business better than they do. So when you talk about being close to your customer, particularly as an entrepreneur, you actually have to think beyond just listening to your customer. You actually have to think through what he's telling you to what his actual answer is. Because coming back to the Red Hat story about the primary benefit is the feature of control. When we would do our surveys at Red Hat, this is now 96, 97, and we had a few dollars worth of revenue, so we could afford to do a customer survey. And when you would ask them the top 10 things about what they liked about Linux or liked about Red Hat, control over the technology never showed up in the top 5 things they needed of these surveys. The interesting thing is that would show up in the top 10 every time, and everyone's top 10. So everyone had a slightly different top 10. Control over the technology showed up in everyone's. What the customers themselves didn't understand is they needed control. They didn't think they needed it because they thought about it and they said, "Well, golly, it's been 6 months since I looked at a piece of Linux source code." But it's this rule that they only needed control over the source code, whatever, a few percentage points of their month. But unlike every other feature on their list that some subset of customers needed, the source code was of great value not to 10% of the customers or 2% of the customers. It was of great value to 100% of the customers 2% of the time. And that's what made control being the key value proposition for what we were selling. Since then, of course, and by the way, I just found this one out today. So Red Hat started in my wife's sewing closet. Just another story for you, and then I'll take another question. Red Hat started in my wife's sewing closet, but not if you talk to Mark Ewing. So Mark is my co-founder, but Mark and I, so in public, we refer to each other as co-founders. In private, when we get alone, we arm wrestle over who actually founded Red Hat. Because Mark started the software project that was Red Hat, and I started the legal entity that was Red Hat. So I founded the legal entity, the company that has since become Red Hat, and all Mark did was start a little software project. Mark's version is, as you might expect, the precise opposite of that. Fortunately, Mark's a very good guy, so we get along on this topic. But the point is, what I just learned today, talking to Deb, whoever the community lead is for Red Hat these days. Deb Bryant. That's the one, thank you, yeah, Deb Bryant. I just found out Red Hat employs 9,000 people. 16 years ago, it was in my wife's sewing closet. And the reason, by the way, it's employs 9,000 people is because the Red Hat board of directors fired me in 2000. Like, direct correlation between Red Hat's success and their firing of their idiot CEO at the time. The actual story was much more collaborative. I understood I did not have the skills to grow Red Hat from 400 people to 9,000 people. So I was more than happy to fall on my sword and pass that responsibility to Matthew Zulik and since to Jim Whitehurst. Other questions? Sure.
So open source software as a movement, as a set of communities, has matured a lot, I guess, like 20 years since you founded Red Hat. What do you think about it seems like the open source movement has bled into other areas like open hardware and some other things like that. What do you think about those which are kind of in a earlier state?
Okay. This is actually where my passion is, and it's why I got into the open source world, and one of the reasons, what is it? Einstein's line goes, success is opportunity meeting the prepared mind. And every now and again, that is such a fluky phenomenon that the intersection between those is one person. And that person can be a complete idiot like me, but if he's the one person, he gets an opportunity like Red Hat. So one of the things that put me in a position to recognize what open source could be was I've always been a huge fan of free markets, of Adam Smith, of just this concept that you build the right structure. You allow people to compete with each other in order to serve customers. Because Adam Smith's view of the world was, in a free market democracy, the consumer and the citizen are the same person. And you can solve social problems in the marketplace. So back before we did Red Hat or Michael Tiemann did Cygnus Solutions, the Justice Department was thinking about breaking up Microsoft because there was no solution to Microsoft's ownership of two major monopolies. And you go back early in my career, what I've always enjoyed about business is the collaborative nature for it on behalf of your customer. And it was this idea that if we could solve this problem in the marketplace, the Justice Department was thinking about solving legally. What's really cool about this free market democracy system is if you solve a social problem that makes the world a better place, the world will reward you handsomely for solving that problem. And the bigger the problem you solve, the more the world rewards you for solving the problem. So the concept of dreaming big is really a self-rewarding concept. You may as well dream big because that's where the big rewards are. So our idea that open source could replace proprietary software generally was a big enough thought that it's allowed Red Hat to become a 9,000 person business doing billions of dollars worth of business in a year. So early in my career, I have examples of things where I did not think competitively. So I partnered with my competitors to solve customer problems back in the computer rental days, only because I always thought collaboratively about industries. So I think of that as an ongoing opportunity. Most business people treat their competitors as their enemies, and they aren't. Your competitors actually don't care about you. They care about their customers the same way you do. If you can solve a customer problem by partnering with your competitor, do that. If you can solve a customer problem by giving away software, doing what he needs you to do, and you deliver more value to your customer by doing that, then that's what you should do. So it is, some of this gets into the political realm of it would be nicer if our politicians in Washington understood the dynamic of free markets and wrote legislation that allowed more competitors into the space rather than legislation that favors one competitor over other competitors. But we don't live in a perfect world, so we'll keep working on that one. Did that answer your question, or what are you thinking about more specifically?
Well, I was thinking about other types of open source movements aside from software, like open hardware, and I guess there's other ones like open data, open government.
Well, all I can tell you, yeah, I'm in favor of all of them. I don't think there's another industry that can benefit to the extent that software has been able to benefit from open source, simply because software was such a feudal system prior to open source. But in the hardware business, back when I was in the hardware business, what we understood, this is no longer true, but at the time, everyone understood that hardware evolved forward faster than software did. And no one could explain it to me. Because hardware, you have to build an effing new factory to get hardware out the door. Software is just some kid like Mark Ewing working in his spare bedroom. So why did hardware evolve forward faster than software did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? And the answer for it was the only people allowed to touch the software were the engineers in that software company, whereas hardware was done much more collaboratively even then. So Intel would produce a chip, but then they would publish all the specs to that chip so all the hardware guys could use that chip to build better computers. And they did. So hardware always evolved forward faster than software did. That's my point, but I am in favor of every effort, whether it's in law or hardware or transportation, to build better open standards.
So, speaking of hardware, drones.
Drones, yes.
So, that was my drone noise, right?
That's a very good drone noise, too. Yeah, yeah.
You've invested in Precision Hawk,
Yes.
right? Are they doing open source stuff in that area?
Yeah, of course, and they benefit from a lot of open source. So, and I should explain why I'm wearing this hat. And the reason I'm wearing this hat is the guys at Red Hat haven't sent me a red hat recently, so I just didn't have one. And the only hat I had with me was my Precision Hawk hat, but thank you.
If you don't wear it, I will literally run it.
If you would, okay. So my sort of issue, the reason I was a terrible student, the reason I became an entrepreneur is no one would hire me. So the reason I became an entrepreneur is you'll find that if you really are a bad student and as a result you can't get a job because your resume is so bad that no one will employ you, what you do is you go to Kinko's, you print up a bunch of business cards that say Bob Young President. Okay, and the value of that business card, because you have no customers and no product, the value of the business card is not in your business, it's to give one to your mother. Because your mother was vaguely socially embarrassed by her youngest son because he was such a bad student and there was no hope he was ever going to get a decent job. And now she could hold her head up in her bridge club because her baby was president of his own company. Okay, and the reason I was such a bad student is I had ADD back before ADD was fashionable. And I'm now 60 years old, and I haven't outgrown my ADD. So I'm involved in Precision Hawk in the drone business, in Lulu.com in the publishing business. I'm up helping Red Hat pitch to their global alliance partners on Monday. And I'm involved with the Hamilton Tiger Cats of the Canadian Football League. Anyways, so, but coming back to drones, drones are really interesting because here's how we think of the drone business. It's not about the drone at all. It's about data collection. If we could have drones surveying, and our focus is not on populated areas. The legal issues of taking pictures of people's houses, way too complicated for us. We're old farmers. The guys who actually started Precision Hawk literally his dad was a farmer. Our interest is in resource management, and it's in things like water and water concentration. If you can take pictures of a field every day, 3 times a day, you can get your irrigation in that field down to precision. You no longer overwater the wet areas and underwater the dry areas. You only water as those plants require the water. And so this ability to collect data and to use, whether it's farming, whether it's forestry, whether it's mining, we can use the world's resources so much more efficiently if only we knew where they were and what they were. And that's what the promise of these drones actually is. Some of the drone stuff where you're going to have small drones taking pictures of you sunbathing in their backyard, not all technology is good. That's one of the reasons why we have regulators, is to stop us from making the world a worse place. Our goal is to make it a better place. So that's why I'm excited about what Precision Hawk's doing. Sure.
So I want to ask you about healthcare. So in healthcare, there are plenty of industry standards, specifically interoperability. There's lots of great standards. There's lots of great open source software and assets. So I wonder if you have a prescription for making that area more successful for
Well, I'm an investor in a thing called N-Contact, which is a medical device that treats heart fibrillation, is the condition. And over the last 6 years that I've been an investor there, I've learned everything I didn't want to know about the healthcare industry and about innovation in the healthcare industry. And the problem is, and do you have a background in healthcare? Do you do this? Okay. As you know, the problem with healthcare is the risk component of healthcare is just so extreme, and the PR problem with that risk issue is so extreme. So you can invent an application or a procedure that solves 99% of the sufferer's problems, but kills the other 1%, and you've made the world a worse place. No one wants to take a medicine or undergo a treatment with a 1% chance of dying, no matter what the upside is. So that's what the FDA struggles with every day of the week. And the FDA is it's an arm of the US government. It's, as a result, subject to any bad publicity in the New York Times. And they've built a whole bureaucracy around a positive side of actually measuring medical outcomes in order to approve things that actually work. But by definition, a very risk-averse process. So it takes literally decades to get things approved because none of us are willing to take the risk of dealing in experimental medicines. How you solve that one, I don't know. But the good news is, and you probably can speak to this better than I can, there is a lot of work being done in data sharing, anonymous data sharing, where we don't share who you are and what your we share what your condition is, just not who you are, and now we can build better models of cancer, what do they call them? Areas? Sorry? No, cancer-fighting drones. No, I'm thinking of the highlights of there's more cancer in Lackawanna, New York, hotspots, or yeah. Clusters, that's the word I was looking for, thank you. So that's as much as I know about healthcare. Other questions? Do you have any specific questions? What are you trying to do?
So you said that with open source software, one of the benefits was that people have control over the source code, and that's sort of what you were selling them on. As things start moving towards this whole blah blah as a service thing, could cooperatives, sort of kind of like mutual insurance companies back in the day, where the customers own the company, could that value proposition of not only are we selling you the service, but you're also the little owner of this service become a value proposition?
It could. So let me answer the question slightly differently. Because I've been sort of thinking about this one philosophically. You know, when software goes to the cloud and you're no longer installing software on your computer, hell, it's not even your computer anymore, much less your software, you don't get source code. And you don't, a license to modify the source code doesn't do you any good. You're buying computing power by the application or by the customer or whatever. And so on the face of it, you sort of, on the one hand, worry that our society becomes increasingly dependent on a few big players who've written all and control all the software, and they don't distribute the software. Because the whole genius of the GPL, and by the way, for all that Richard Stallman and I have this love-hate relationship, I think he's one of the heroes of this whole space because of his invention of the GPL. Prior to the GPL, there was nothing like the GPL. There was only copyright. And if you tried to put something in the public domain and someone took your stuff and changed it a little bit, they could copyright not only their changes, but your original stuff. There was no concept, legal concept of the public domain. What the GPL changed, and all the other subsequent licenses from the GPL, is it changed the concept of let's use copyright law to keep things to create a public domain. And that's what Stallman started. The Creative Commons is doing it in literature and all the rest. But Stallman started the concept of understanding if there isn't such a thing as the public domain, how do we create one? And that's what the GPL is. So I think of the GPL, whether you like it or not, as a moment of pure genius and probably one of the biggest single innovations that allowed this whole phenomenon to occur. Hell, what were we talking about?
Cooperatives in terms of
Cooperatives.
being a value proposition and blah, blah, sister.
Yeah, so it's the cloud. And so Richard worries a little bit, with some justification, because every innovation brings benefits and risks. That's life, generally. And the risk with it is that we end up surrendering control to the guys who put everything. I mean, you know all the concern most of us in the open source space have with automated voting machines? And the fact that the software inside those voting machines isn't open to public scrutiny. And you just go, well, I don't think anyone's monkeying with the voting machine, but what if they were? You know, what does that do to our democracy? Okay, well, that's just one example. Now imagine that voting machine being on the cloud. You know, anyways. So there are risks, but in general terms, what still is distributed, what open source still is all those people who are putting their applications on the cloud are still working collaboratively on the software that they have to write to put on the cloud. And more of that software is, in fact, open source software. Because the beauty of the cloud, what it allows the software programmer to do, is to write open source software, to work collaboratively with other open source guys without it impacting his business model, because his business model isn't about delivering CDs of software. It's about delivering service to his customer. And so the fact that he gave away his software, no one cares, because he's not trying to generate revenue selling software, he's trying to generate revenue solving customer problems. So there is a risk associated with the cloud that we have to think through, but there's a huge benefit to all of you guys who are trying to start software businesses, is now you don't have to worry that you're creating a competitor by giving away your software. Other questions? Sure.
Question is, there was an open source from before Red Hat. Red Hat, part of the open source was there, but you made this one as a professional person. So what was this step? Is just forming a company, charging a customer subscription fee, or there is other additional thing which you have to do which will make this whole successful?
Yeah, now you're into what it takes to build a successful company. And it really does revolve around all the hard work of understanding what your customers need and building a company that solves that problem for the customer. So in Red Hat's case, Red Hat's been through at least a couple of iterations. I won't speak to the ones in the last 10 years because I haven't been part of the Red Hat management team but in my period with Red Hat and subsequently afterwards, we started selling diskettes, selling shrink-wrap software. Okay, we went from that to selling services along with selling the diskettes. But by services, literally, we would go and visit customers, or we would support them one customer at a time kind of services. And then we went to automated, in effect, on the cloud services. And since then, they've gotten into hosting on the cloud, or I don't know, you'll have to talk to the guys at Red Hat to get where their revenues are coming from these days. There is no magic bullet to it. It is a lot of hard work staying up with your customers and understanding and thinking through where the opportunities, what are other suppliers in the market not doing for those customers that you can do better for them. One of the great examples, to give you an idea, that inspired us very early on, and by very early on, we're talking Mark Ewing and I doing not enough business to pay the rent on our apartments, but yet we were paying attention to what, another mental block, IBM, Making Elephants Dance, who was their CEO? Gerstner, thank you, Gerstner. Gerstner's great insight at IBM was IBM, so I was in the computer leasing business, I dealt with IBM in the 80s. IBM was the very definition of a technology company going out of business. They were so just out of touch, and they were operating like a bureaucracy. And so, I would try and get a hold of my rep at IBM on a Friday afternoon, and you could never do it. He was always off playing golf. And I was going, who in the technology business takes Friday afternoon off? Gerstner came into IBM and got it turned around in 3 years. I mean, it was miraculous. Technology turnarounds almost never happen. The two great examples we have are Apple when Jobs came back in and IBM with Gerstner. Gerstner's insight, though, was he went around and talked to a whole bunch of IBM customers and found out that the customers didn't actually like any of his products. They were okay, but there was always, whenever he would sit down with any given customer, there was always someone who did that product better than IBM did. So he had the same conversation with his customers that I had with Dr. Thomas Sterling at Goddard. He said, so why are you buying from IBM? And the customers were saying, IBM is the only technology company with an office everywhere that we do business. And as a result, Gerstner understood that he wasn't selling products, he was selling a service. And he talked about that publicly. And so at Red Hat, we go, okay, hold on. We don't have a product to sell because ours is open source and everyone can use our innovations as quickly as we can. So we're not really selling a product. But Gerstner at IBM is telling us that customers don't buy products, they buy services, things that make themselves more successful. And so that was one of our early insights into what we were doing, was this idea that we were actually in the services business. Even back when we were selling shrink-wrapped boxes of Linux, we saw that as an interim step to getting us big enough that we could sign service contracts with real customers. Sure.
So in a hypothetical situation, if you were to go back to Red Hat and you were tasked to acquire a company,
yeah,
who would that be? What company would that be and why?
Ooh, there's a good question.
Or what type of company?
Yeah. This is where I need my red hat on, and then if you're stock market analysts, you can say, founder of Red Hat says we should do this, and it'll cause a run on Red Hat stock. What would I do if I was king of the world at Red Hat these days? It's a really tough one, because you really have to be thinking forward about this stuff, and there's a lot of really smart people thinking forward. So my wife explains that the only time I ever compliment someone and say that's a really good question is when I don't know the answer. And that one absolutely qualifies. I would suggest it will be an open source. It will be an open standards. I think they should acquire IEEE. Because that's absolutely going in the right direction of where Red Hat's going. Or maybe the Apache Foundation. To hell with the Apache, the software, the Apache Foundation. Or maybe the Free Software Foundation. But it is that theme of staying on the leading edge of this open source movement because it still has a long way to run. Sure.
If you've got a concept for a new product and for argument's sake it's an open source software or hardware or a device of some sort, how do you then prototype the thing and then find your first customer willing to spend actual money for it and find out if it's going to take off?
Yeah, that's probably the thing I like most about open source. Because the traditional model is you actually had to build your product in secret to the point where you could release it to a beta group of people you had to pay to use it, and you had to find those people. The neat thing about open source is you just start working on it on GitHub. You start spamming the world as much as you can with you have this tool. When people start using it, you know you have something that might be valuable. Exactly how you do that, it, again, varies. What's your example? Do you have a particular project that?
Just thinking like some Arduino-based toy or something. Some small piece of technology that you could effectively make out of Arduino parts or Raspberry Pi parts or something, and then turn it into a toy or something.
And so what's your concern? Are you looking for beta testers of this?
Well,
What's your...
If you, let's say you develop this new toy, you think it's pretty cool, then how would you then say, okay, I need to sell this toy, but it's all based on Raspberry Pi, it's all open source code anyway, so I can't really, if I package it up, I might be able to sell it as a bundle and put 10% markup on it, or I can't really sell services around it because it's a toy, and once it's done, it's done.
This is as good an example of my whole point, that I don't have a presentation because there are no set of rules that can guide you in this. Because there are a bunch of moving pieces, but only you and your toy and your target market for the toy and potentially your channel to that market. So can you sell that toy directly yourself, over the internet or on Amazon? Do you have to sell that toy through Toys R Us or through the school system? All of these things will change the economics of what you're trying to do with this toy. If you're trying to sell it through the school system, how many of you guys, well, you've all been in school, so you all know Jostens, the guys who sell you the overpriced school rings and yearbooks? Okay, do you know why those school rings and those yearbooks are so overpriced? It's because of the sales cycle of convincing the school to offer that solution to their students. The cost of selling through a bureaucratic system like a school system and to stay conforming to all of the legislation that affects suppliers to public school systems is such that a $10 school ring suddenly sells for $150. And Jostens is not the world's most profitable company, despite that apparent margin. And it's because all their money goes into maintaining relationships with these very rule-driven bureaucracies. I just use that as an example of a particular market and the economics of entering that market. And so if, on the other hand, you're selling an app for an iPhone, you can sell it for $1 because the margins on selling an app for $1 are huge if only you can get 1 million people to use your app. So it completely varies by industry and by industry. And the guy before me, was it Andrew? Andrew, is part of an industry of people who will actually help you solve that problem for your particular application. Sure.
I would love your critique in my dream project. I'm a blind developer, and I started my career in software developing a screen reader program for the blind to work with the computers. So I did that for a number of years, and now I'm in the other side of the fence. I'm working with mainstream companies to make their applications compatible with the screen readers. And what I would love to do is to have an open source project of that layer that any application needs to talk to the screen readers to be compatible with them so that a blind user can use your application. So can I make money on that?
I would start grilling you on a whole bunch of politically incorrect questions, like how many blind people are there in the United States?
It's about 1% of the population.
Is that right?
Yes.
Wow.
Worldwide, yeah.
So again, it's like the question about healthcare. It's a market that I personally know nothing about. It's a market that Alan Cox, one of the Linus Torvalds, refers to Alan as his number 2 on the Linux kernel project. Alan tried to get us interested in the visually impaired reading space, and we just never found the resources to do that. So I'm aware it's an ongoing issue for the visually impaired community. So if you could solve that problem, the world would in fact be a better place and the world would reward you for doing it. You really have to approach those investors and that community of suppliers to your community. So if 1% of the United States is blind or seriously visually impaired, what's 1% of 350 million people in the world's wealthiest economy? That's a lot of people. It's a big marketplace. So there is a business there, but I'm the wrong guy to ask as to how to approach it.
So
Sure.
actually, this one is not the only the users are on this one. Is actually also your rules and regulation, government, all, this is a big business on that side.
Yes.
Which is actually definitely going to take a lot of business. So it's not just this one person is involved.
Yeah, the service
It's a
would be
rule
sold to the
law.
software companies, because
Yeah.
they have to make their software compatible by regulations and stuff
Yes.
like that. And by the way, Red Hat doesn't have a good screen reader for Fedora.
Sorry, what do you do for Red Hat?
No,
I
they,
work on kernel quality assurance. So
Okay. Okay, you're now working on screen readers. Okay.
And you want it better?
All right. I think we're down to the last question. I'll be hanging out outside for others. Anyone else with a business problem? Sure.
Just, what do you think about copyleft versus permissive licensing and viable business model?
Are you referring to the viral effect of copyleft and the concern there,
Well,
or?
I'm referring to the phenomenon of companies now to avoid the GPL or copyleft software under the premise that it would make their business more successful. And I'm sort of want to get your opinion on it because Red Hat has been so successful around software that was copyleft.
Yeah. Okay. So here's what I love about copyleft, and here's so. The fellow beside me was a lawyer before me. And I have a lot of respect for lawyers, and I have a lot of respect for accountants, but I'm neither a lawyer nor an accountant. And I'm an entrepreneur. So the one thing to remember, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, aspire to be an entrepreneur, rules are not your friends. Rules are the friends to the established players. The rules work for the established players. Your job is to ignore the rules, or find ways around the rules, or to change the rules. Okay. So what I do is I just ignore rules. I try not to get myself thrown into jail if I can avoid it. But what I like about the GPL is it's not actually the language around the GPL, it's the brand around the GPL. And the point is you can write yourself a better license than the GPL is for your software, but the problem is the moment you change so much of as a comment in the GPL, your users have to read your license. Because everyone knows what the GPL does. GPL is a brand. If you GPL your software, people know it is open source software. Or actually, it's free software, to give Richard his due. The moment you put your, Barney Jones license, and you can argue that it's pretty much the GPL just with your little wrinkle to it, people don't trust you anymore because it's not GPL'd, and they don't want to have to read your wrinkle, and they don't want to have to hire a lawyer to read your wrinkle. And so the reason Red Hat uses the GPL is not because the GPL is any good. It's because it is the GPL. And so I'm a huge fan of the GPL for branding reasons, and I'm not a fan of monkeying with the GPL. But the beauty is, the more people monkey with it, the worse it harms their business. So you may as well just use the GPL and keep moving. Well, thank you very much for listening to me today.